Okay, this is a video to show the layout for cement board for a tile floor in a bathroom. I'm putting tile in this bathroom, and I'm going to be using this hardie board as the cement backer board for the tile, and I just finished cutting out the pieces. When I went to Lowe's, I was actually going to be buying a different type of cement board, but when I looked at what they had in the stock, this material, the hardie backer board, to me looked easier to work with because the edges were nice and sharp. The corners were firm. The other material looked kind of ragged. I forget which brand it was, but this one was a couple dollars more. I got three 3x5 sheets. Gave me a total of 35 square feet. 2 sheets would have given me a total of 30 square feet, and this room I had calculated needed 31 square feet, so I was a little torn. They actually, some of the cement boards were listed at 4x8 feet. That would be 32 feet. It seemed if I got one of those, I might actually possibly be able to cut it up and fit in this room, but they didn't have those in stock anyway, and I didn't have a way of carrying those in my car. So what I did was I got 3 of these 3x5 sheets, knowing that I certainly would be able to do it. I'd have some left over, possibly quite a bit left over. Well, I got these hardie backer boards, and I followed the instructions on the internet. They recommend leaving 1/8 of an inch between boards, and I did lay it out like that. And basically, in a room, what you typically will find is that the walls are not completely square, so that the tolerances that you get in one area might be quite tight, and then they're opened up in another. So the 1/8 of an inch did seem to work for this size board, and when I laid them out is in rectangular cuts. This board was nice to do rectangular cuts because it actually has a grid. It might be a little bit hard to see, but there's actually a grid lines on the board. Okay? And that helps when you're laying it out and cutting it. And it cuts up nice and square. Now the way you cut this board, they have instructions on the internet, is you scribe it. They say you can use even a utility knife, but they recommend this special cement board scribing knife, which has a carbide tip. I was very happy with this. I'm glad I didn't try to do it with the utility knife, because I probably would have really got a sore arm, because they say you have to really press into it. This works pretty good. And you scribe it on one side and then snap it off. And that worked pretty good, although I will say that the back side ends up, in other words, you scribe it on one side, you snap it, and on the back side of where you snapped it, it ends up being ragged. And that raggedness, I tried putting the ragged edges up against the wall where it was cut. It's hard to see, but so that but you'll see some of them. Here's an example. Well, here are 2 cut edges meeting, and you'll see that it's a kind of a ragged edge, and that's another reason why the 1/8 of an inch planning for an 1/8 of an inch space really doesn't give you an 1/8 of an inch space. It's just that it allows you to actually place the boards in. Now I later found out that if you want to get a nicer, precise cut, if you actually scribe it on both sides, then when you snap it off, it will give you a clean cut. Okay, and the other thing that I started doing after I laid them in was I would use this tool, not the sharp cutting edge, but the side of this. In fact, right here you can see. I used that to rub over the edge after I had snapped it to take away some of the high spots. Because I found that the high spots it was more irregular than I wanted, or than it really had to be. So I would just run that over that to smooth it off a little bit, but I still had some rough edges. it wasn't until I got to a couple of special cases where I had to snap off a very narrow piece. So for example, what you'll get sometimes is you'll have a certain dimension and you need to snap off just, let's say, 1 inch. Okay, it's very difficult to snap off 1 inch. What I found was for 1 inch, I was able to do it by taking my back deck. And where there's a space between the planks, that space is just about 1/4 of an inch. So if I slip one of the boards down into that gap and then snap it off, I can snap it off at about 1 inch. But to make sure that it worked okay, in those cases, I scribed it on both sides. It wasn't until I got to the end that I had to do that. And I scribed it on both sides primarily to make sure that it would actually break where I wanted it to. But what I found was it actually cut off very clean. And on another occasion, where I had to snap off 2 inches, and that was actually too deep to get into the deck, we used another technique where I put this level down on the 2-inch section. Let's say I wanted to snap off two inches off of this particular board. I would just cover the short section, pull up on the long section, and then I would stand on this level while I'm reaching to pull up. And I had my wife stand on it too, because you needed a lot of weight to do this type of a thing. So you can snap off smaller sections, but you need to basically develop a jig. Some type of a jig that will hold the short section while you fold up the larger section. If you had some sort of a brake for bending metal, that might work too. It was when we were doing a 2-inch section, my wife mentioned, why don't you scribe it on the other side also? Because I was having, difficulty with the short section pulling it up to snap it. And I told her, well, the instructions just say to scribe it on one side. But after she mentioned that, the next time I did it, I did scribe it on both sides, and it worked even better. So I definitely recommend that if you have time. It's not as fast as scribing it on just one side, but this is just a small job, and it's not a big deal. So I ended up with 7 pieces because of the rectangular nature. I wanted only to cut rectangles, and this room has several little cutouts in it. And in my original plan for these two were all going to be, these two here were going to be from the same sheet. But after I installed this one back here, and I was about to get ready for this one, I realized I'm not even going to be able to get this sheet in because there's a significant overhang on both sides here. And had I cut this as one sheet, there would actually have been no way to get that sheet into that position. If I had done it, I would have had to cut the sheet in half and then slide the 2 halves in. But I realized that I needed to design it as 2 pieces, and that allowed me to do a slightly different layout of the boards. What I did was I did a layout of the room on grid paper, and I made a mock-up of the 3x5 sheets to try to see how I was going to fit them in, because I wanted to make sure that I had a relatively small number of cuts, and I didn't want to have a mess out of it where I couldn't actually find a piece to fit a certain rectangular shape. I wanted to know about that ahead of time. And I did notice that while I was doing that, as I went to make the cuts for a new sheet, what I would do is I would, double check the actual dimension of each of those. And it's when I was doing that I did notice that I had made a mistake in my original layout. In my original layout, I had the dimension of this particular section here listed as 34 inches, 34 and a half. But that was because I didn't take into account the 3 inches of this measure. Now, I know that this has 3 inches, and I got it correct in many other locations, but when I was taking all the measurements for this room, originally I had this dimension here listed as 34 and a half. Should have been 37 and a half, but this is just an example of measure twice, cut once. I did catch this before I made the mistake, otherwise I probably wouldn't be telling you about it. Of course, over the years I've done that many times, cut the wrong length of something, and sometimes you get screwed and lose the material. Other times you have to make a recovery plan. Okay, so I did get this all to kind of work out. I do have some small pieces downstairs, you know, that I ended up not being able to use for anything, but I do have a couple of relatively large pieces left over that I will be able to use if I do tiling on another room. I ended up with 7 pieces. I've got 1 through 7 here. And then I've got some leftover rectangles. This one, this one, this one. That's about it. This might be another one I didn't have in there, but it worked out okay. Pretty happy with it. I need to mix up the mortar, apply the mortar, lay them onto the mortar and screw them down, but I did end up with one piece that was only 2 inches wide. I think that's going to be fine. It's a little bit unavoidable if you want to do rectangles, because this little cutout is pretty much going to have to be something like that. This one right here was another one where I had to design it as 2 pieces, because there's an overlap here, and on the other side there's an undercut. One single piece. I couldn't figure. I probably wouldn't have been able to slide it under. This board is not flexible in any way. The cement, you can't flex it to get it into position like you could some other things, like a piece of wood. Okay, well that's all. Thanks. Stop.